women composers who wrote works for the clarinet in Russia and the former Soviet Union. First, a concise look at the history of how the clarinet came to Russia. When Peter the Great initiated a number of reforms in the process of westernization in Russia, that laid the groundwork for the development of clarinet playing and clarinet music in Russia. After having founded St. Petersburg, Peter the Great passed a decree that every military division should have its own wind band in 1711. Initially, featuring trumpets and percussion, soon oboes and bassoons were added. Peter the Great started to invite musicians from abroad, mainly from Germany, who were who invited the first opera companies to Russia and founded Russia's first choral orchestra in St. Petersburg. The fashion of inviting foreign opera companies continued under Catherine II. First documented evidence of clarinet in Russia originated from this period. In the middle of the 18th century in the German, but what other factors influenced such a strong gender instrument relation? Whereas in ancient times, both women and men played on various musical instruments, including the Greek double pipe reed instrument aulos, in the Renaissance, a new image of the so-called decent woman was formed. Playing a wind instrument, such as the clarinet, was going against the norms of a decent woman and had therefore to be avoided. Blowing into the instrument is a very physical act, associated with power and bodily strength, which a tender woman supposedly could impossibly have. The playing position with open arms and the movements while playing the clarinet could not suit a proper woman, which goes in one line with the limiting dress code of that time, including corsets for women. Taking the mouthpiece into the mouth to produce a sound could even more be seen as indecent and even provocative with an erotic connotation. Moreover, the aesthetic ideas of that time about the sound of a clarinet or other wind instruments being loud, possibly ugly, and aggressive was seen by silent, beautiful, and always restrained. This conception must have been created by men, I guess, enhancing their power and masculinity. But as a consequence, women performing music would be allowed to play only plucked instruments such as harp, lute, or guitar, but while watching the decent playing positions with closed legs, keyboard instruments, later also string instruments, though preferably small ones like the violin. The first accepted wind instrument for women was the flute, and of course singing was allowed. But all these instruments fulfilled the stereotype of feminine instruments for centuries. Moreover, in Russia it was not common for women to appear in public until far in the 19th century. But their participation in music was seen as a part of good education and could only take place in private circumstances. So, I forgot to open my PowerPoint. Doesn't matter because now I would change the slide, so I do it now. Just a second, please, and my apologies. So here was only the title. When did the first women then start? Oh, yes. Yes. When did the first women start to play the clarinet in Russia, and who were there? There's not who were they. There's not so much material available on this topic, so I will discuss here a few documented examples. The Russian clarinet teacher Alexander Maestrenko lists in his book Кларнете saxophona России from 2017 the names of 453 Russian and Soviet clarinetists, out of which only 5 are women, which is less than 2%. One of the very first documented women clarinetists in Russia was Serafima Shumilova, born in 1914 in a small village in the Chuvash Republic. After finishing her basic school, she worked in a factory for some years and started to play the clarinet at the age of 19 only, entering the Cheboksary Musical College, Muzikalne Uchiliще. Here is a photo from that woodwind class from 1934, with the teachers Kuteladze, the clarinet teacher Gruzdev, and the director. Shumilova sticks out on this photo, not only as being the only woman, but also by her neat clothing and her mature charisma, at least in comparison to the young boys. On this photo, from the same time, we see Shumilova in the student orchestra. All students are male, except Shumilova and two more girls, one in the front and one in the middle on the left side. But those two girls are without any instrument. Most probably, they were the harpist and/or piano players of the orchestra, which would match, again, with the stereotype of feminine instruments. As an interesting side note, the conductor of the student orchestra was the Polish-born violinist Sigismund Gaber, who was repressed 3 years after this photo was taken, sentenced, and died in a Stalinist prison camp in 1946. Shumilova succeeded well in her studies and continued at the Gnesin Academy in Moscow. She was even accepted to play in the Moscow Opera Theatre Orchestra, probably being the first woman to play the clarinet in a professional orchestra in Russia, or for sure among the first ones, and thus highly exceptional. Nevertheless, she quit playing completely, returned to Cheboksary, and worked as a clarinet teacher in the local musical college. The most famous Russian woman playing the clarinet, or the most famous Russian woman clarinetist, is Margarita Shaposhnikova. However, Shaposhnikova did not gain her fame as a clarinetist, even though she won prizes at leading Russian clarinet competitions and worked as a concertmaster clarinetist in the Moscow Wind Orchestra for several years. That means she, as a woman, was leading all the others, all men in that wind orchestra. Quite remarkable. But she got famous as a classical saxophonist and founder of the first Russian saxophone class at the Gnesin Academy in Moscow in 1973. These two pictures date both from the 1960s, the left one a bit earlier, but just a few years difference. Concerning the artist image that these photos create, the style difference is remarkable. The clarinet photo being rather traditional, but the right one emphasizing the feminine appeal of Shaposhnikova. To my taste, even giving the saxophone almost a side role in comparison to her leg. And Shaposhnikova paved the way for the saxophone as a recognized classical instrument in Russia, as well as for women performing on the saxophone, which can be seen until the present day in the number of women clarinetists in Russia. And how is the present day situation of women clarinetists in Russia? Unfortunately, I could not find any official statistics on the gender ratio in Russian orchestras. And so I don't know whether this has been done, but I wanted to get an impression anyway. So I collected data about the musicians from several orchestras from their websites about the staff. The percentages which I am presenting here are thus without any scientific claim, but just meant to give an impression about the present situation. I consulted 4 leading orchestras from Moscow and St. Petersburg: the State Symphony Orchestra, Gosorchestr, the former Svetlanovsky, then the National Orchestra under Pletnyov, the Bolshoi Theater, which has actually about 2 orchestras, and the Mariinsky Theater, which has about 4 orchestras, with a total amount of 800 musicians taken into account. From these data, the total percentage of women performers in the orchestras is around 1/3. When looking more in detail, we see that the gross of women plays a string instrument, which is also due to the instrumentation of a symphony orchestra, of course. The woodwind female players form 3.25%, the same as the other instruments, which are harp, piano, and percussion. The percentage of female brass players is a full 0. Now it is interesting to look at the females in the woodwind section more precisely. Flutists take the overwhelming majority of 70%, followed by oboe and bassoon with 15% each. And the amount of female clarinet players, exactly 0. This surprised me, because I'm aware that the clarinet still is a male domain to a quite big extent, but for comparison, the average amount of female clarinetists in orchestras in Europe and the USA lies currently around 30%. So in Russia, the situation really is remarkably different. And it reminds me of the situation here in Europe, how it was about 50 years ago. From my very limited set of data, I counted the amount of women in the orchestras per instrument. It is astonishing how much this diagram represents the traditional instrument gender stereotypes from centuries ago. Harp, piano, violin, and no women clarinet or brass players at all. I looked also at other orchestras, but it was about the same story everywhere. I could not find a single female clarinetist in the orchestras. So what about higher education then? Among the conservatory teachers, I encountered 19 men and 1 female, Margarita Ons from Novosibirsk, which is already nice that there is at least 1. For deeper research, I would need data from the music schools as well, both concerning teaching staff and concerning pupils, especially, in order to see whether there might be a tendency of a growing amount of girls playing the clarinet in present day. But I was not able to find any data for now, so maybe later. So as I could not acquire any data, I took as one small example the list of graduated clarinetists from the Moscow Conservatory. Among the 308 clarinetists who graduated at the Moscow Conservatory between 1850 and 2021, there are 11 women, well actually 10 because one of them is me and I'm not Russian, not count myself there, but anyhow. So indeed there were not many women studying the clarinet before me at the Moscow Conservatory, which explains my odd status a bit better. But the most interesting point of this list is the clear increase of women clarinet students in the past 10 to 15 years, which is a positive signal and hope-giving. I am convinced that girls and young women playing the clarinet in Russia would need still far more examples and role models of women clarinetists in the professional world, both as teachers in higher education especially, as orchestra musicians and as soloists. Moreover, the ongoing discussion on gender equality in clarinet music, as it is led, for example, in the International Clarinet Association, in research projects, and in the media, this discussion, to my understanding, still has to start in Russia. And of course, this discussion goes far beyond clarinet or wind players alone, but about equality in a much broader sense. So, before I run out of time, I would shortly go to the second aspect of this presentation, women composers in clarinet music. In my recent artistic doctorate, I treated the topic of Russian and Soviet clarinet music from a performer's point of view. And also there, I noted that the amount of clarinet works by women composers, though it is small, it is highly interesting musically. Due to the limited time frame for it now, I grouped the compositions or the composers who wrote for the clarinet here by decades, using their first work with the clarinet as a point for orientation. The Greek Sonata by Ella von Schultz-Adayevsky is the first work for the clarinet composed by a woman in Russia, as far as we know for now, because it is also a problem of history writing, of course, as very often women composers were just not mentioned. Von Schultz-Adayevsky was quite exceptional in many ways, and so is her music. When I compare it to the works written around the same time in Russia, the Grieg sonata appears much less clarinetistic, and I do not mean that in a negative sense. It would be very interesting to know whether she had contact to clarinet players, and if yes, to whom, or whether she even had herself the possibility to get acquainted with the instrument, and how, as Rimsky-Korsakov did when he tried to learn playing the clarinet while he was composing the Concertstück for clarinet and wind orchestra 2 years earlier in 1878. Also, the interest in ethnomusicology was increasing around this period, and also Orientalism became a fashionable topic, also in clarinet music. For example, in the Arabesque by Alexander Taneyev from 1883, and the Oriental Reverie by Glazunov from 1886, from the two orchestra pieces. When looking at the Soviet period, we encounter the well-known women composers Ustvolskaya, Gubaidulina, and Firsova with their clarinet compositions. From the Baltic countries, there are Maggie Einfelder, Arne Reingold, and possibly even more. Among the younger generation, emigration became frequent after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, such as in the case of Chemberchi, Rayeva, or Auerbach. However, there is a highly interesting and still entirely under-researched aspect: the work of women composers from the 1920s until the 1950s, roughly spoken from and around the Stalin era. How did the image of Soviet women reflect on composing music at that time, especially for such a male instrument as the clarinet? But this aspect I need to leave for now as a topic for future research, especially because I did not have the possibility recently to travel to Russia due to the pandemic. I really hope to look for material on these women composers and their clarinet works in the archives and libraries in Russia in the near future. To conclude with, I would like to go shortly to the thesis website of my, here it is, of my doctorate, where I compiled a database on clarinet music from Russia and the Soviet Union in 1917 to 1991, including, of course, some women composers. Okay, so here I have the database. And for example, if I give the search of Firsova, then here are the her works with the clarinet. So this is maybe interesting for, well, I guess even people who know Russian music very well might find here composers of whom they have not heard before. The second part here is my artistic view on this repertoire, and for example pointed grouped by topics, like here on Jewish music, but we do find here the women clarinetists, women composers, Ustvolskaya, Firsova, Rayeva, Firsova, and Chemberchi, which I performed in my doctoral concerts. And because I could not give a lecture recital now through Zoom, I would like to let you just hear a very tiny video example from the Sonata by Katya Chemberchi, a lesser known work, but very beautiful. And I hope that you can hear this. This could also be a topic of another research, to go even more deep into what makes it special in the work of the women composers in comparison to the male composers in the clarinet repertoire. But let me see if I can go back to the PowerPoint. Yes. So here is a selection of bibliography. Some sources, the websites of the orchestras and conservatories. And I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I would be very happy to hear some comments and questions. I'm sorry I lost the time because I don't know when I started, so I hope I'm okay. I stop sharing now, and thank you for listening.
Any questions for this wonderful talk? I really appreciated hearing that snippet of the performance and your beautiful playing there. Again, I just think that this is just a marvelous example of dedicated and really passionate research. And I'm very grateful to hear about your work. Yeah, any questions? Go ahead, Maria.
Do you think it's relevant, maybe, how little known the clarinet might have been to the general public as a sort of serious instrument? I'm sort of thinking in the period you mentioned between 20s and 50s, the idea of using a piano or using a violin to get to move up in society. I'm thinking of people like Gilels and Richter sort of creating this image of you go and win a competition and you move from the sort of Odessa slums into stardom narrative that's very strong actually in Soviet educational mindset, and whether the lack of a seriousness around the clarinet is influencing parents not to sort of see it as a viable option. And secondly, whether the more vernacular idea of a clarinet being a lesser instrument, like Utosov's jazz band being sort of the primary mindset for where that belongs, rather than in a sort of a decent cultured home, and how that fits into the Soviet idea of family and values, and whether that's playing a part in any of this.
Yes, I think definitely about the first one. We also see it in the later development of chamber music with the clarinet, for example. Glinka's Trio Pathétique from 1832, it was performed in Russia for the first time in 1894. So it was obviously not very common yet to have the clarinet in chamber music context in Russia. So definitely also the military music and this army instrument and cheap instruments. Of course, the orchestra players would have the good French instruments, but there were also those like Czech fabrics, or like I sometimes tried those instruments that they are almost impossible to play, really horrible. So of course they sound bad and it sounds false, and with the development, especially as orchestra instrument, which of course already, like for example Tchaikovsky, and so the clarinet had this solo status in the orchestra, but the players who were performing the clarinet solo in the orchestras were all foreigners, which didn't have so much contact then with the broader populations. So it was very much apart. But then I think like around the 1920s, it must have started to change when Sergei Rozanov became the first Russian clarinet professor at the Moscow Conservatory and started to develop the real like Russian clarinet school. And of course it took its time to get a higher status. And if I come back to the example of saxophone, that is what Shaposhnikova did very well, that she insisted on the saxophone as a classical instrument, because it also had the image of this jazz instrument and a bit like shimmy instrument, or how should I say that in English? So it's a bit parallel to the clarinet, but of course the symphony orchestra was always for the clarinet like the high class. So yeah, for sure it has influence, but still I think like the clarinet anyway had like the great Russian players, like for example Rozanov, the first one, and then Sokolov, and like all kind of very appreciated soloists on the clarinet. But it still was like a niche instrument, yes.
Any other questions? Go ahead, Courtney.
I'm just so excited to see someone else researching Adayevsky. So very exciting. And I'll mention this in a little bit, but just to answer your question, she composed the Greek sonata in Paris, and as you probably know, and of course it was written for clarinet or violin. And
Yes.
so, I think that absolutely influenced her sort of mode of instrumentation and writing there. And I think she really was going for that Greek sound rather than any kind of really normal use of the clarinet. But it's just so fascinating. Have you played the piece?
Not in public, just for myself. And yeah, it differs very much from the other pieces who are composed in Russia at that time, and actually also from any clarinet repertoire. So it's a special case. And I know too little about, so I'm looking forward to hear more from you. I know much too little about her because it was not part of my doctorate, which started from 1970.
I'm just so thrilled to see her name up there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I
I see some messages in. That's private. But I did send my doctorate address in the chat.
Do you know this book by Sophie Roberts, Lost Pianos of Siberia? Have you seen it?
Yes, well, I have not read it, but it's on my list. I would like.
No, it's a wonderful book, and it's about Siberia, obviously, and it's about classical music instruments and the histories of several unfortunate pianos in that area. And one of the points that was made is that from the 19th century into the 20th century, obviously in rural areas, sending pianos like string basses and harps was a difficult thing to do. But there was a fairly robust distribution and dissemination of smaller instruments that you could play, in a sort of traveling context. So I'm just wondering whether you think, as a further extension of your research, that you could do something like the Lost Clarinets of Siberia as a kind of project, whether or not the research in those areas of the Russian Empire or the Soviet Empire that Russian Musical Society established sort of music schools, whether there's actually a kind of lost clarinet history there that has yet to be researched. I was just wondering what your thoughts were about that.
Oh, that would be absolutely tremendously interesting, especially because it really draws my attention, those very first clarinet players who are mentioned there, like from the 1930s, or the two first ones, which I don't know anything about, and how the very early period of clarinet playing among women, especially then, even before the Stalin era, and how the founding of the Soviet Union influenced the woodwind world and the clarinet world. So I yes, would be very interesting, but I have to.
And in general, the other question is this gender bias something that you also see in the world of the oboe or cor anglais? Is it, these woodwind instruments in general, or is it something particularly gendered about the clarinet and its representation?
Well, this is a bit strange. So do you mean in general, not only in Russia now, or?
Well, I think in general, but I'm interested also in the Russian context.
Well, yeah, I mean, I had this one slide with a flute. Of course, flute, very many girls playing the flute, but even there, like the biggest soloists in flute are mainly male. So, and in the orchestras, it's quite balanced among the flute players. Oboe and bassoon, especially bassoon, to much lesser extent, women in general. But then for clarinet, well, in Europe and USA, it has really like gone up in the past 20, 30 years. Before that, it was much less. But still, when it comes to the clarinet, if I look at, for example, the soloists, and I said about 30% of women in the orchestras. But then if looking at the percentage of first clarinetists, the clarinet soloists, that percentage is very small. So there's many unbalanced things. Also, like in higher education, the clarinet professors are mainly men. And it was only very recently, last year, I think, that a big discussion started that why are the juries of the international competitions mainly men? Like, where are the role models for the young clarinet students, women, to go to a competition and you have a wall of old men sitting in front of you that have to judge how you play. So there's things going on, but still far from real gender equality or balance.
It's interesting because obviously within the marching band context in the United States, right, where it's mobile and you're dealing with, you know, among other things, you know, the size of these instruments, but it seems that clarinet playing is, you know, predominantly female within the marching band tradition here. Okay, yeah, so because of time, I wanted to thank you very much again for this wonderful paper.